I'm Brent Taylor, the D100 Advocate, and this is Dice Tumbler, the RPG podcast about game design and tabletop-related musings. Today's topic, Actionable Exposition. I was having a conversation the other day with one of my GMs about a Blades in the Dark game that she had run and her frustrations with making that world feel alive. I was a player in the game, and while I'd had a lot of fun with the game itself, the world building from the player's perspective was a bit of a problem. Blades in the Dark is very much designed as a sandbox, in the sense that there is no fixed story or direction. It's designed to be almost entirely driven by player goals rather than by the GM giving any strong direction. Players decide almost everything in Blades in the Dark, taking on many of the traditional GM roles, including what each scene is and what the current score or quest is. In many ways, it changes the GM and player relationship of traditional games. While this isn't a strict rule, in traditional games like D&D, the players react to the GM. In Blades in the Dark, the GM tends to react to the players. If your players are proactive about both setting goals for their characters and acting on them, the game runs very smoothly. On the other hand, if your players are more on the passive side, waiting for the GM to point them towards obvious quests, the game kind of grinds to a halt. This is a big part of the problem my GM was facing. Most of her players are not used to this sort of GM-player relationship, nor are they used to that sort of open freedom in sandbox play, and didn't know how to set actionable goals for their characters, or how to engage and interact with the world in a way that would allow them to figure that out. Her players asked for more world building, something they could grab onto to figure out their characters' goals. I generally would argue this is the wrong solution to the problem, but it's still worth discussing. This conversation got me thinking about how I might solve that problem, and as a result, I've come up with a few rules I think I'll be following in the future when presenting the world to my players, also known as exposition. The first thing my GM tried was to start each session by reading out headlines and articles from an in-world newspaper. These were fairly long and drawn out, often taking 5 to 10 minutes. I admit, it's a cool idea, but in practice it just puts the players to sleep. It was just too much information in too short a time, and in practice, these news blurbs were forgotten within a few minutes. This leads me to my first rule. Don't narrate exposition. You'll lose your players' attention. Think back to school. Have you ever had a teacher just sit there and read out a chapter of a textbook to the class? Did you remain engaged, or did you find your mind wandering? This is the same situation. Just don't do it. The next problem she ran into was the content of her news blurbs. She had this entire narrative running in the background about labor union strikes, some minor civil unrest, and squabbles among the nobility of the world. In the right game, those ideas can launch entire campaigns. However, this is Blades in the Dark, a game about daring scoundrels, criminals, and their crews operating in the shadows of society. We play thugs, criminals, cheaters, and liars so that we don't have to labor. And while it's possible that our crew may at some point in the far future gain enough power that the lives of nobility might be important, we start out as a little crew with no name, no territory, and no power. We're nobodies. Nobility is so way above our pay grade. This brings me to my second rule. Exposition should be actionable. Players need to have both a reasonable way to interact with the aspect of the world you're dangling in front of them, and they need a reason to do so. In the context of Blades in the Dark, telling players that there are a number of labor union strikes around the city isn't terribly important to daring scoundrels, and there's nothing for them to do with that information. On the other hand, a player's character picking up a newspaper with a headline informing them that there's a labor union strike planned next week that just happens to be right next to their crew's next target, that could be useful information. And it's actionable. It gives your players some additional information, something about the world, and it's something they can use in planning their next heist. Maybe they can use the strike as an ingress point, or maybe they see it as a problem with more eyes on the scene and something to be wary of. Or maybe they can use the strike as a scapegoat to cover their tracks. It's something they can interact with and something they can use. Now, I've said you shouldn't narrate exposition, and that exposition should be actionable. If you can't narrate exposition, how do you convey information about the world? This is where my third rule comes in. Exposition happens as a result of interaction. If a player's character picks up a newspaper, that's not only interaction, but a signal they want information about the world. Keep it brief, actionable, and to the point. On the other hand, chances are they won't pick up a newspaper. they're likely to simply arrive at the target of their score to find out there's a labor union strike next door, with workers chanting, picketing, and marching out into the street. This is setting the scene and putting an obstacle or point of interaction in front of the players. Now it's important, and the players discover this as a direct result of their interaction with the world. Now the players have an unforeseen problem in front of them, or perhaps a golden opportunity. That's up to them to decide and for them to act on. There's nothing wrong with giving some exposition at the beginning of the first session of a campaign, but keep it brief, keep it exciting, and only give as much information as they need to discover the world themselves. Don't take that experience away from them. Don't narrate exposition. Expose the world to the players as they directly interact with it, and always keep it actionable.